Hello, and welcome to the Lend Hoping Nothing podcast. I'm Michael Humphreys, and I'm happy to be talking to you today. Today, this is episode 17, and I want to talk about time value of money. And time value of money is really interesting because it was kind of the first uh, entrance for myself into studying usury because time value of money is so central to understanding finance and all that goes into it because there's all these investment opportunities and the management of money and various types of contracts and things. And so I remember back in the day, gosh, it was probably 8 or 9 years ago. I was reading the Just Thomism blog by James Chastek, I think his name. Um, at the time, I think he was a PhD candidate. And he had written a blog post on usury. Unfortunately, I think he's since taken it down, which is unfortunate, partially because the one that he has up now, I think, is far worse. But in that, he talked about usury and what's problematic about it. And so I left a comment, and I forget exactly what I said, but it was something about time value of money. Well, what about time value of money? And a commenter responded with something very unhelpful about, well, are those future goods or are those profits guaranteed or something like that? At the time, it made no sense to me. Um, and it's not up anymore, so I can't actually go and see it. So um, that was kind of my first introduction into thinking about usury, and so um, part of that was kind of like, okay, well, this doesn't make any sense to me, and no one here is helpful, so I'm gonna go try to figure it out. Because if insurance was usurious for whatever reason, or finance in general, then I couldn't in good conscience continue. So so it's very central to the problem of usury. But the important thing that I kind of want to discuss today is kind of to get into a place where we understand what it actually means. Because the typical kind of understanding of time value of money is that, money is somehow, productive or valuable, or, it grows over time. And this is probably one of the most common objections to usury amongst those who are not particularly familiar with the literature, is that, well, money is essentially capital now. And so there's time value of money, and so I should be able to, get some interest off my loans, regardless. So the first kind of thing that I kind of want to make clear is, so in a previous episode, I had talked about time preference, and maybe this is just idiosyncratic, but I typically think of time preference and time value of money as related but still distinct concepts. So, time preference, as sort of a concept of Austrian economics, kind of refers to this idea that goods in the future are valued less than goods that are present. So if I had the choice, I would prefer to have goods today rather than having the same good a year from now. And I've been reading Father Divine's book, Interest, where he talks about time preference and the way that he kind of explains it and gets to it. And so there's this sort of idea of this, all goods kind of generate this sort of psychic income. And so one of the things that we face is, well, do we receive that income now or in the future? And so part of the problem is, well, how do we value things that generate goods in the future? And so Thomas Woods in his book kind of gives the example of land. And so the problem, as they state it, which I think is misleading and incorrect, is that land will generate goods potentially near infinitely, so some very large amount. So if you grow crops on land, you can keep growing more and more crops throughout the years. And the issue is, okay, well, if we aren't able to, if those goods are not as valuable, or if those goods are as valuable as goods today, then we have this problem that the value of the land, kind of approaches infinity. It just gets bigger and bigger, because you just take the sum of all of the goods it will ever possibly create, and that would be just the value of the land. And so, but we know that land or any productive good is not actually infinitely valuable. And so there's this idea of the farther out a good is into the future, the less valuable it is. And time preference is sort of the anthropological way of explaining why that is the case, that we prefer things now more than in the future. The issue with Father Divine, though, and I think the issue with the way time preference is considered generally, is that it abstracts from what actually generates the good. So it considers that the value of that future income as something abstract that can be considered apart from that thing which generates the income. And I think that's the key issue with time preference. Now, time value of money is something I think very different. So you have time preference, which has this sort of anthropological grounding, but I think time preference needs to be understood as sort of the metrical system by which we value those goods. So time preference says, well, future goods are worth less than present goods, and time value of money is a sort of mathematical framework for quantifying that realization. And so the issue, though, with understanding the time value of money is how it's actually set up. So it's not as if your money just sort of grows by itself. And this is the problem with abstracting from the generator of the income, abstracting the income from that, because your money doesn't generate more money, and that's a common way to characterize usury, is trying to generate money from money. Although I keep thinking that's a very misleading way of characterizing usury. So the issue then is, okay, so we have this problem where we need to come up with some way of measuring the value of a productive good. So we have a productive good that's going to generate goods into the future. So this really comes with the philosophy of measurement, and the sort of, how do we measure things to begin with? And so, I wrote my master's thesis on time, which is something I am endlessly grateful for, because of the way that it helps me understand finance. Because money is a measure. Interest rates are a measure. And so it really clarifies what's going on. So now with time, and I've talked about this before, you are trying to measure motion. So like with some sort of productive property, we're trying to say, okay, well, we have this productive property. How do we put a dollar value on it? Like, how many dollars is it worth? And so, you have some sort of motion, the train going from New York to Chicago. How long is that? How do we measure that motion? And so we measure it with time. And so what you do is you get a clock and you say, okay, well, the clock has moved this much and the train moved this much. It went from New York to Chicago and it went this many rotations around the clock. Okay, so what does that mean? So what's going on there is that you have specified some sort of unit of measurement. So with a clock, each tick is a second. And then you can extrapolate that into minutes and hours and so forth. But you have this unit and tick, 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 and it is something moving. And so you take this something moving as the standard, and with time, a second is actually defined by the frequency of radiation from a cesium atom. It's something like that. And it's very, very regular, which is extremely important for measures, is you want them to be as stable and constant as possible, which is why, inflation is a problem for money. And so you want a clock that's very stable and constant, because if each tick is plus or minus some variation, then you don't get the same measurement every time and so forth. So but you have something that's moving as the standard that you use to measure something else that's moving, and then you're able to say, okay, well, this was 600 ticks. So that's what we'll say the duration of this time was, 600 ticks, or 600 seconds. Obviously, a train from New York to Chicago in 600 seconds is absurd, but I mean, you get the point. So the question with, productive goods is, well, okay, so what are we going to use as the sort of fundamental measure to measure other things? And so the most basic one that I can think of, at least, is the risk-free rate. And basically what this is it's typically tied to government treasuries, because the probability of default of the government on its debt securities is near zero. In fact, it's theoretically zero because they can always print more money to issue out in payment. So they don't need to have a reserve of dollars. They can always make more. So theoretically, the probability of failure or default is zero. So it's risk-free. And so that kind of gives you a way to establish a sort of basis or metric from which to start. And so from that you can say, okay, well, this risk-free bond, which costs $100 today and will pay out $105 a year from now with 100% certainty, so that is worth $100, and so the interest rate is 5% per annum. And so then that becomes a baseline for determining, interest rates. And so that just becomes the standard. And it's probably the most stable standard we can come up with. Maybe there's something else, but at least this is kind of how you get started with it. Now, you can compare that to something that is more risky. And there's all sorts of theoretical frameworks that you can come up with this. So, and you can do the calculations. So ultimately what you would want is sort of this statistical, the expected value in the future would have to be X. And so if you have a bond that we're going to say is worth $100 today, then in some sense, you at least want the expected value. So on average, it's going to return, $5 in the future. But it's going to, 90% of the time, it's going to return, I'm not going to do the math right here. But it's going to return, X amount of dollars, and then, 10% of the time it's going to default, so you're going to get nothing. And so you can come up with a probability weighted estimate such that, okay, on average it's going to still return, the 5%. But there's a probability that's going to return, 7 or 8, 9%, whatever that is. I probably should have done that calculation beforehand. But that gives you kind of a basis for then determining what the value is. And so you can then go on and do things like, do something like the capital asset, the CAPM model, capital asset pricing model, which includes, the risk-free rate as a standard, but it also includes sort of this mega market rate as another standard, as a standard related to the risk of the market, and then some sort of measure of the risk of the particular asset you're trying to calculate. And so this sort of forms a metrical basis for being able to price these sort of things that have income generating in the future. So the long story short, I don't know, we're already about 18 minutes in. But the story basically is that time value of money has nothing to do with money being productive. Basically what it's saying is that you can invest your money into different assets. And given this sort of metrical framework where you're bringing in different standards and ways of valuing things, the risk-free rate, the market rate, and other things, risk probabilities and so forth, what it's ultimately kind of telling you is that, this is a metrical structure. This is a way of determining the value of productive assets that you could purchase with your money. And so given those productive assets, they'll generate more money with you in the future. And so you can reductively and mathematically and financially reduce this to merely a series of cash flows. So, I have a negative cash flow at time 0 when I buy the asset. And then I have, over time, maybe I have interest payments, and then I have the return of the face amount if it's a bond, and so then I can calculate, and then when it's put in that sort of framework, it becomes abstractly this sort of idea of, well, your money kind of grew over time, but not really, because what happened was you bought some sort of property interest in some sort of productive asset, whether that was a bond or a stock in a company, or you invested in some real estate or whatever, and it generated value over time, and you receive that value in return. Time value of money just tells us how to actually calculate what is the value of that asset. So that kind of way of thinking about time value of money, I think one is correct, but also kind of helps drive out this sort of idea that money is productive and generates value on its own. It only generates value like that when you're considering it as abstracted from the productive good. And that's fine as far as it goes. You can like in physics, you can consider a cow a perfect sphere for all intents and purposes that you want to engage in that sort of abstract consideration. But really, what we're talking about ontologically, the reality of it is you have productive assets that are generating things, and the abstraction, that confusion of confusing the abstraction for the reality is the central problem, and it's the central confusion for time value of money. So, and this is important for understanding not only properly the cash flows and understanding the legal and ethical questions, but also just what's actually going on with the value generation. So that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today. Feel free to leave your thoughts or questions or objections down below, or email me. I was recently told that I've never actually given my email. So my email is actually lendhopingnothing@gmail.com. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me there, DM me on Twitter, or leave a comment. So thank you for your listening, and have a good day.